that there are many places in which the Bible talks about internal organs for God, liver, the sort of organs that often in biblical language are used to speak about feeling. And that's something that I want to think more about. I don't like to take refuge in figurative language. I think there is a sense, though, in which those things often do the work of speaking about emotions in biblical texts and not always tissue. So you're right. You do get a sense of internal organs, although those may be ways to think about feelings and cognitive or emotional processes.
Hello and welcome to It Means What It Means, the podcast in which a guy with some college and a day job has long-form conversations about biblical texts. Today's guest is Jennie Grillo, and we'll get to her as quickly as possible. I set the article up and everything in the conversation, so I don't need to go into that here. I'll throw in the standard. If you're listening for free, please follow, subscribe, rate, review, all those nice things. I'll appreciate that very much, and it will help me in my ongoing uphill battle against the algorithm to build an audience in the face of not having one, which seems to be the only way to build an audience is to have one. So as I navigate that confusing relationship with math, I just ask you to throw as much support as you can behind the podcast, whether that is following it on your platform of choice, rating, reviewing, that kind of thing on your platform of choice, subscribing, following, and interacting on social media, anything from Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, Blue Sky, Spoutable, Threads, any of the myriad places that you can go for social media. Establish a parasocial relationship with me. I'd really appreciate that. Ultimately, though, where I really, really, really would love for people to go is over to patreon.com/itmeanswhatitmeanspodcast and become a supporter for $5 a month. You get episodes 12 days early, plus any additional content that I eventually start to put up there. So in the interest of keeping this quick, that's it. Enjoy my conversation with Jennie Grillo. I'll be back to set up next week's episode at the end of the conversation. Jennie Grillo, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me.
Before we get going, will you tell us a little bit about yourself?
I am Associate Professor of Theology at the University of Notre Dame, where I teach. I'm in the Christianity and Judaism in Antiquity area, where my field is Hebrew Bible, Old Testament. And I've my 8th year at Notre Dame, came here from Duke, and before that I was in Oxford, where I just did my study.
Cool. So I'm assuming, do you know Tzvi Novik?
Yeah, he's just on staff.
Okay. Yeah, I was lucky enough to have had him on.
Nice.
Yeah. Okay. Maybe I'll start collecting more Notre Dame folks for the podcast. So we're going to be discussing your article on having a body, time and divine embodiment. And up top, you mention Benjamin Somers. So his work is very important to this article. So would you mind explaining what his work is and what it did, so we can just kind of go from there?
Sure, I'll have a go. I think people should take it from him and not take it from me. But I guess his book, The Bodies of God in the World of Ancient Israel, from 2009, has been one of the sort of most widely read and most important books in biblical studies in the last 15 years. And in some ways, I am not presenting a lot of different evidence. I'm just suggesting a way of summarizing or understanding or assessing his evidence differently. What he does in that book is to give a number of examples of what he calls his fluidity model. He sort of gives that as one overall heading for what he calls fluidity of divine selfhood and multiplicity of divine embodiment, by which he means the fact that in the Hebrew Bible, God is encountered in different bodily manifestations, in different human-like figures, even in objects, and that these seem to change over time and not be continuous, and God's self seems to be able to split itself and appear in different forms, and he the title of his book uses a plural, bodies of God, but I'm in a way arguing more with the reception of his book, which has been very much to take as an axiom the idea that the biblical God has a body.
Okay. Yeah. So have and body are very important words to you, right?
Sure.
Okay. This happens a lot, but particularly with articles where I'm reading it and I'm like, oh, wow, I don't understand. So this one, I kind of walked away with like, wow, who am I? What are we? Because the question of being and embodiment are so, like, they're so entangled, right?
Yeah. Well, I think what I was trying to suggest was what you are and I am and our experience of embodiment is different to the God of the Bible, and so different that a sentence like God has a body doesn't very well capture the fluidity of the biblical material. Because when we talk about having a body as we do, we generally mean having and being stuck with a body that we always have, that we don't have sometimes and not other times, that we can't just sort of cast off or take up or exchange for another one. It's a sort of unbreakable relationship of self to body. And I was suggesting that all this emphasis that Summer draws attention to about the fluidity of God's various embodiments in the Bible isn't really like having a body as we have them. So maybe have is not the right verb. And also perhaps body is not the right noun, since the things that we have, flesh and blood and bones, are things that are not predicated of God in the Bible. So maybe not has, and maybe not body.
So I think we probably run the risk of kind of reading and understanding of like a completely non-corporeal, omnipresent, omnipotent, infinite being. Is that what is represented in Hebrew Bible, with brief interruptions of embodiment?
I'm not sure that I would say yes to that. I guess what I was trying to do in this article was to ask questions about whether there are in fact lines of continuity between those later formulations of systematic theology that you mentioned, ideas like omnipresence, incorporeality, and the biblical material. Because in some ways the biblical material looks very different. You know, we have God walking in a garden and fighting with Jacob. You know, they don't look incorporeal. They don't look all that omnipresent, although that's not all the biblical evidence. But I was just trying to suggest that the ways that God, we could perhaps say, interacts with a body in episodes like that are not the same as, at least they're not the same as our experience of having a body. And there are kind of breaks and discontinuities and kind of gaps and inconsistencies in a way in God's use or inhabiting of a corporeal body that mean you can kind of see how this could be end up along a trajectory with a very differently presence kind of being.
No, that's fair. I just know, I don't know. I'm trying to avoid like negating a position to kind of get at what you think there is happening. But I know that there's and you may not be. I know she's mentioned in your article, but for Francesca Stavrokopoulou, for example, you know, God, the God of the Hebrew Bible has a body in that depiction.
Yeah.
And then I think on the other end are people who are saying it's a completely infinite, non-corporeal, like, I don't know, they may deal with these passages that describe anthropomorphic representations of the divine as like, that's poetic, that's figurative, or that kind of thing. And you're not saying either of those. You are. I do like the term fluidity. So you are saying there are instances, and you use specifically Genesis and Job, right? So do you want to dig into some of the passages in each of those that you refer to in the article?
Well, I mean, we've talked a little about Genesis. Perhaps I could mention Job a little. I think Job is a really interesting case for thinking about what embodiment is like, just because Job's experience of being embodied is so much a part of what he wants to talk about in the book, and about his physical suffering and so on. And in Job, having well, a little group of things, having flesh and bone and skin, and having a limited amount of time as well, having days that run like a weaver's shuttle, seems in Job to be almost definitional for what it is to have a body, and not just to have a. Yeah, sometimes Job seems to, this word flesh that Job sometimes uses just to refer to, the flesh under the skin, what we think of as flesh. But sometimes he uses it simply as a sort of metonymy for his whole corporeal existence. He'll say, my flesh trembles. I don't think his skin is staying still, but the tissue under the skin is trembling. It's just his body that trembles. So the book of Job seems to have a strong idea of what the body is. And it's something that doesn't apply to God. It's striking that in the Hebrew Bible, it's flesh, basar, is never predicated of God, also not blood, also not skin and bone. So a book like Francesca Stavrakopoulos or others that sort of catalogue the anatomical terms for God in the body, it's interesting what's missing. They almost read a bit like kind of extremities, but no trunk, no sort of central mass, or certainly not a central mass that it's easy to get in your hands, and that would just seem to be a real difference in the way that the Hebrew Bible, which certainly uses anthropomorphic language to talk about God, there's a real difference in the way that it imagines God. It's certainly not it's not all the way to transcendence or incorporeality, but it's also not. It's not an ordinary body like the way the Bible talks about the human body, or even like the way some other texts talk about divine bodies.
And the flesh distinction is there between humans and animals, correct?
Well, so it's interesting. I think in this article, I mention the fact that for Job, as also for the J writer at the beginning of Genesis 2, having bone and flesh is pretty definitional for being human. And it's true that the man in Genesis 2 will recognize the woman as being like him because she has bone and flesh like him. That's not a distinction that is made from animals most commonly, though. So I've got another article that's just come out on flesh in the priestly source. And in the priestly source, I was looking at a few chapters in Leviticus in particular, but for the priestly source, humans and animals are alike in having flesh. God is not like them, but humans and animals are sort of there together on one side of a contrast with God, who doesn't have flesh. So P, we're like animals, and our experience of being embodiment is like animals' experience of it.
If I'm not derailing the conversation, I am curious. So you mentioned the P source, you mentioned the J source. Are you a proponent of other sources in the documentary from the documentary hypothesis, or is it just the P and the J?
I mean, it's not my particular wheelhouse or primary interest. In this article, I do sort of take into account the different presentations of God's sort of embodied presence across different sources in Genesis. And I partly do that because when I was first thinking about this, I gave a paper on it, and someone asked a very good question that isn't this apparent discontinuity just a discontinuity between sources? Is it really that we're being shown a God who is here one minute, not there, who looks like this in one place and like this in another place? And so I thought that was a reasonable question, and I did then go back and look and see whether that was a complete explanation for the kinds of sort of choppiness in God's self-presentation. that I was seeing in Genesis. And I don't think it is, even though sure there are some distinctions. The God of the J source is, more physical, if you like. Whereas in P or E, if there's such a thing, you get more in terms of appearance without such a specification of a body. Nevertheless, at a redactional level, those are all being presented as the same self who doesn't have a consistent bodily self-presentation. So the inconsistency is real.
That's an interesting that there are diverse perspectives that are all kind of feeding toward. We're talking about the same. I guess being is tough because I'm still. I won't say confused, but I am still having trouble wrapping my head around. And I think I may have put something to this effect in the questions. I think I was operating under the impression that like consciousness is the most foundational aspect of being rather than embodiment. So I don't know if I'm taking the conversation backward and bringing that up.
I will. Maybe I wasn't trying to address what's the most foundational aspect of being, simply the question of, is God straightforwardly embodied? Does he have a body in Genesis? And I was just suggesting that it looks from the way that this you could also say a character in the narrative, this self, this actor, God, doesn't, although he's presented by the kind of final form of the text as a continuous self, doesn't have a continuous bodily presentation in the way that we normally mean when we talk about a self that has a body.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, I don't mean to. I worry that it is a digression on my part. So there does seem to be some overlap for the people who are saying God has a body between or attempting to read Hebrew Bible as, I guess, largely continuous with the religious and theological understanding around the development of Hebrew Bible in the ancient Near East. And so I started wondering immediately, like, well, is there a lot of continuity? And you mentioned, I'm probably going to say this wrong, Cathar, Wahasis, and Danil. That this is a narrative in an adjacent culture. Do you mind explaining what that is and how that relates to this article?
Sure. And this is not my idea. So many scholars have compared this tale Akat with Genesis 18, because you have the same sort of situation. You have Abraham and Sarah, who are visited by God, who accepts their hospitality and promises them a son. You have the hero Daniel having this god Kothar Hasis come visit him, and it's just a parallel narrative. Other scholars have made that comparison before. What interested me about it was how differently the god in each case seems to occupy space and time. So in the Ugaritic narrative, you get a sort of perspective from the viewpoint of Daniel, of seeing the god come. He sort of approaches from across the fields, and he looks up and sees him coming, sees him walking, walking a long way, big steps, divine, whatever. But he's still walking through time, and he's got to get there. And then when he's eaten and drunk with Daniel and his wife, and given them gifts and gone away again, he gets up and goes home. And the text says that he leaves for his tent, his dwelling. Whereas in Genesis 18, Abraham looks up, and there is God. He's there. He didn't come. He's just suddenly there. And then at the end, there isn't that same. He went off to his place, even though Abraham, goes off to goes between places in the narrative. And I mentioned a couple other sort of type scenes in Genesis where there are encounters between people at wells. It's a sort of stereotype almost, but you always get the coming and going and the time it takes for people to pass through the landscape. That just doesn't happen with God in Genesis. So that would be a little contrast with the presentation of a God in a cognate culture. I'm not at all, though, saying that this is an absolute contrast. And there's a diversity of ideas in the cultures around the Bible as well about the extent to which gods have bodies like humans. And it wouldn't be surprising if there was a shared understanding that God isn't embodying quite the same way as we are.
Okay. Yeah, that's interesting. And you did kind of mention this before, but I just caught in my questions up there the phrase "God has parts but not a whole." Can you go more into that? So you said like not a trunk, and then I'm trying to remember, are there passages where it's like God has a heart or something like that? Is it not the the animating and functioning, like internally functioning parts? How does that work?
Yeah, no, that's a really interesting question, and you're right. There are there are many places in which the Bible talks about internal organs for God: liver, heart, the sort of organs that often in biblical language are used to speak about feeling. And that's something that I want to think more about. I don't like to take refuge in figurative language. I think there is a sense, though, in which those things often do the work of speaking about emotions in biblical texts. They're not always tissue. So you're right that you do get a sense of internal organs, although those may be ways to think about feelings and cognitive or emotional processes. But lots of hand and foot. Again, we could think about whether that's a way of thinking about agency to a certain extent. Certainly a lot of face. Interesting to me that face is absolutely speakable of God. As strangely as his back. Those were kind of surfaces. But it seems to, but blood, bone, and especially flesh, not thinkable of God. Those don't ever get predicated of God across biblical texts. And flesh itself seems to be, so biblical Hebrew doesn't really have a word for body like our word body in English. It doesn't, that's just not an easy equivalent. There are a few that are hardly ever used and more often refer to dead bodies. But there isn't really an obvious equivalent of body in biblical Hebrew. And the term that most often does duty for body is flesh, basar, which can't ever be said of God. So that's what I mean by saying it seems much more thinkable to the biblical authors to speak of parts than of a whole, or of a kind of big mass, if you like, for God.
So for those organs, a liver or something like that, and I understand if you don't know entirely to say, but would our understanding of a liver match with an ancient person's understanding of a liver?
The person to ask. I feel like you'd have to ask someone who knows about extispacy, and I definitely not supposed to ask about ancient livers. And this is all part of a larger project for me. And those internal organ speech patterns are things I want to think about. But I think it's kind of broadly accepted that there's some element of speaking about cognitive or emotional processes when we speak about those things. I mean, for example, the Bible doesn't really talk about God having digestive organs, say. In fact, he the food that's offered to him, he processes differently. You know, it's for smell, not so much for consumption. There's people who eat it are the temple functionaries. It's food, but not necessarily food that's eaten. So that would be a sort of less cognitive, more biological kind of internal organ that God doesn't seem to have in the biblical presentation. And I think there's also a sense, and again, this is something I want to explore and haven't really thought about since, but I was just teaching Jeremiah this morning to students, and there's also a sense in which, especially in prophetic texts, the body of the prophet kind of has a certain overlap or a certain shared sensibility with God himself. And so sometimes you're not really sure whose physical body is being talked about. Is it Jeremiah's? Is it God's? So that would be another way of thinking about the bodily language of emotion and cognition for God. To what extent it's it's kind of shared with a prophet rather than being really predicated of God.
I understand there are, especially in academic worlds, there are different emphases and disciplines and things like that. I think what I worry for a biblical text is someone reading an English translation and coming across something and thinking they know, well, it must mean the thing that I think of when I, right? Like this word is rendered as this anatomical thing.
Okay.
And that's more what I mean so we have an ideology, but it's our norm. And I'm wondering, like, would this match with how an ancient person would be thinking about something like that?
Yeah, I think, we get a rough idea that when in the Bible, a person reads liver, kidneys, womb, stomach, those are the things that we think they are. But there's still another much larger question about what that language is doing, which will be different across different texts. But it isn't always as straightforwardly literal as it could be.
Yeah, that's absolutely fair. So, okay. The fluidity of a divine body, and it does seem like there's a diversity of approaches within the development of biblical texts and then around the development of biblical texts. But it I guess, long story short, it probably is not safe if you think you have an understanding that just fits with whatever theological model and you're approaching a biblical text. So if someone is reading, so we'll go to the story of God approaching Abraham and Sarah. How would you, what advice would you give to someone like, hey, you're going to be reading this passage. Here's what I want you to look for in this with regard to divine body?
I guess I would just say that it's interesting to pay attention to the ways that, while certainly this is an encounter between Abraham and a figure he takes to be a human, so looks enough like, or three humans, looks enough like humans for Abraham to think that's who he meets. Nevertheless, it's not as unambiguously an embodied figure as it is when Abraham and Lot are outside together. That there is something discontinuous, strange about the three or one divine bodies that Abraham seems to encounter. And this isn't original to me. Everyone who's read this text has always wondered about the oddness of that divine manifestation that seems to be like a body but not quite like a body. And so my question is simply, given that it's so odd, does it really make sense to sum it up by saying God has a body?
And then, okay, jumping over to Job, because I know that there's a little bit more diversity in the representation of the divine engaging with Job. Like there's a whirlwind at one point, but
right, yeah.
So is it just descriptions of the divine approach that we're inferring there's embodiment there, or is it the same thing where Job is also speaking to someone in a human form that is also the divine?
It's interesting. It's really interesting that you mentioned the whirlwind speeches, because Job's own way of summing that up at the end of the book is he says, my ears had heard of you, but now my eyes have seen you. But the whirlwind speech has really been just a speech. We haven't been told that God appeared to Job or what he looked like if he did. So in that particular case, it seems almost as though hearing from God is Job is able to think about it as seeing God, but we didn't get to see that he saw God. The ways in which the book kind of more explicitly talks about God and embodiment are things like, say when Job says, he says to God in chapter 10, do you have eyes of flesh? And the assumption is, no, he doesn't. Just as he says to God, are your days like the days of a man? And again, it's a rhetorical question that's inviting the answer. No, God doesn't have a limited length of time on earth like Job does, and he doesn't have eyes of flesh. Job seems to belong to the sort of flesh realm, and he seems to assume that God doesn't. That's, in a way, that's why God isn't qualified to test him as he is, because God doesn't share that experience. So, I mean, Job uses languages like he sort of sinks his he looks at me with his eyes, or he tears me with his teeth, or whatever. But somehow Job seems to be able to say those things while not thinking that God has flesh, even though flesh in the book of Job is so central to what it is to be embodied. And flesh for Job will even serve as the word body.
So, and it's fine if you're like, oh, that's not really a thing that I've dealt with. So, being restricted to a body, but within time, like those two factors, they go hand in hand, right?
Yes. I found the factor of time to be just a very helpful heuristic as I was thinking through these problems. And I've noticed that in some recent work in Jewish studies, there was a particular attention to the factor of time in the experience of embodiment. And I guess that's true more broadly, that the study of the body has been a focus of interest in the humanities for the past several decades. And lots of the things that the people examine to understand the experience of embodiment involve time, like growing old, aging, working, going on pilgrimage, pregnancy, bodily decay, dying and disintegrating. All these things take place along an axis of time. And so that to talk about embodiment or having a body invokes time as part of the experience of having a body, and also continuity through time, that you your body one day is the same as your body the next day, from 1 minute to another. You can't space and time are on a, they're the experience together. You can't get out of time. Whereas God's embodiment in biblical texts, biblical narratives, again, seems to be different. He doesn't persist through time, in some of the ways that we've been talking about in those episodes in Genesis. And I put it together with Job because time also seemed to be a part of Job's experience of embodiment. That really famous man that's born of a woman has but a short moment to live. It's full of misery. He comes up, is cut down like a flower. But having end-stop time is sort of definitional to the experience of embodiment for Job as well. And yet he can say to God, do you have eyes of flesh? Are your days like the days of a man? No, because God doesn't share that experience of embodiment.
Is that something, and you don't have to account for other people's work, but is that something that those who are a little bit, who are, I guess, those you're trying to remind that there is fluidity of the bodily representation of the divine in the Hebrew Bible, do they factor time into their assessments that, like, oh, God has a body? Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does make sense. I mean, I don't need to remind anyone that there's fluidity of divine embodiment. That's not my contribution. Benjamin Summer has done that with consummate skill and success. So I'm not contributing anything on that. I'm simply wondering whether all that fluidity is best described by saying God has a body. So on the question of time, no, maybe not. Maybe people have been a bit more interested in space than in time. So that was something that I kind of came across as a new tool to think about these things with, the aspect of time that has so much been a part of the conversation previously.
Okay. Yeah, I'm sorry. Look, that was probably a reductive representation of what you're...
I don't want any credit that I don't deserve, and I don't deserve any credit for drawing attention to the fluidity of God's body. That's not original to me.
Oh, okay, that's fair. But also 2009, I know that's not a long time in scholar years, but that's 16 years. That's a little time. People sometimes forget things in that span of time.
And it hasn't been forgotten. People are still talking about it just as much.
Yeah, I know this was not your intent, but this was a challenge. Like I've said this a couple of times, and you don't have to defend anything in this regard. But the biggest challenge for me was finding out that, like, I did not realize that embodiment carried all this weight. And I guess I don't mean that as a pun. Like that it is so important to understanding what existence is. And I will say, like, I kind of think this phrase a lot, that like, if God is in a way that's different than how I am, right? Like they are different, no matter how you approach it, they are different kinds of existence. But when you really start to ask the question of like, if you don't just want to hand wave physical representations or attributions of the divine, particularly in the Hebrew Bible, if you don't just want to hand wave those, how do you deal with them? And it sounds like there is a wealth of conversation being had in the scholarly community, but I don't know that has necessarily trickled its way down in as nuanced a way as you guys would like into the popular conversation.
Right. Yeah, but I think those are really important questions, and I think in thinking about this, I'm interested in finding ways to think about how traditional Christian affirmations about the mode of existence that's proper to God are thinkable together with the biblical text. But I guess what I'd like to avoid is maybe a view that they're just completely different, and that Christians confess God as spirit and incorporeal, whereas in the Bible he just is a body like anybody else's. And that's why I think it's useful and important to draw attention to the ways that in the Bible, the body that we see God in is not a body just like anybody else's.
So I'm glad that you did mention Christian theology, and I know that your area of expertise is Hebrew Bible, but I was thinking, like, this it feels like this adds a few layers to an understanding of an incarnational theology that, like,
right.
Look, for sure, like it is different than most Jewish theology to say, like, nope, God was incarnated as this human being, but if you don't want to, that's fine. Does that situate itself at all in your thinking, the incarnational aspect of things?
A good question. And in a way, it's not. It's also a question that's already sort of out there in the debate, because Benjamin Summer in his book uses the language of incarnation reasonably frequently, and describes God's manifest. Well, he is he does a lot of work on the you and I have been talking about the anthropomorphic appearances of God in Genesis. Summer's work also takes into account things like the betals or sacred stones that he calls incarnations of God. So yeah, and there's been a certain amount of discussion around the applicability of incarnation as a term to describe the ways that God is encountered in sort of material ways in the Old Testament. I guess what I'm suggesting is that in the same way as having a body implies not being able to shake it off, having the same body tomorrow as I had today, continuing in this body without the possibility of any fluidity. In the same way as that doesn't really describe the Hebrew Bible material very well, incarnation doesn't describe the Hebrew Bible material either, because I think incarnation is pretty close to having a body, it's not a here today, gone tomorrow, fluid, sometimes you're incarnate, sometimes you're not, kind of way of describing a relation of self to flesh. The incarnation is much more like having a body. You don't just dip in and out of it. And so, yeah, I guess my questioning of God has a body as a helpful rubric for considering the Hebrew Bible material would also suggest that incarnation isn't a very accurate rubric to describe the Hebrew Bible material. Incarnation is something different, and more like having a body, which I'm suggesting we don't really see in the Hebrew Bible. Although we see things that are it kind of interestingly kind of cognate with it, if you like, or have some really interesting parallels with it, but they're not the same thing.
Yeah, no, I mean, I don't think there's any question that to say that, like, okay, this incarnate being, though, like, even if you're saying this person is divine, to Jesus, for example, Jesus has a body, but then you're getting into, and we don't have to get into this because it's not the subject of your article, but then you get into questions of what is the nature of matter and all of that kind of thing, and that's like some 1 Corinthians 15 type stuff, like this person is raised and it's this kind of flesh as opposed to this kind of flesh, and great, that's awesome. It is nice to know that there is not the just, I think, overly simplistic God has a body. This is where what you're saying is helpful. It's not necessarily God has a body. God can be embodied, and I don't know if that's a God can be embodied or have aspects of embodiment, but is not embodied, does not have a body, is not restricted to the physical plane of existence necessarily in Hebrew Bible. And then you can kind of jump over to the New Testament and have a different conversation. But there's at least a bridge into those, like, for those two areas to be discussed.
Yeah. I mean, also, you mentioned flesh just now, and I think that would be any sensible definition of incarnation is going to involve flesh, isn't it? Just etymologically, can't really be incarnate in a rock because it's not made of flesh. And so the fact that, as I said, just in terms of language use, the Hebrew Bible doesn't use flesh to speak of God means that incarnation is it's not going to apply. He doesn't have flesh, can't be incarnate without being in flesh, which he isn't.
Yeah, there's a lot of thinking to do around this topic. I did my best to cover as much ground as I could on this one because there was a lot here, and often I will just kind of follow whatever rabbit trails come to mind. I did try to be disciplined here, but was there anything in the article that before we started recording you were hoping I would ask about that I have not brought up?
No, I'm not sure. I was hoping you'd ask about anything. No, I'm not sure that I can really say anything. What I guess one thing we haven't mentioned that was for me a useful discovery and a useful thing to think through as I was working on this is that I think I mentioned how helpful I found the work of Carlo Cabino, the medieval historian, who I guess represents a slightly older stage of humanities scholarship on the body, but she really usefully, to me anyway, elaborates the idea of material continuity as something important for early Christian and medieval, and a lot of modern, although perhaps not kind of slightly less recent, modern thinking about the body, the idea that body and self have a sort of tight, unbreakable relationship so that they exist through time, and you have what she calls the universality of body and self. That seemed to me a really helpful way of formulating what the God of the Hebrew Bible doesn't have, and what we normally are talking about when we're talking about having a body. So that was part of my process of writing this, was really enjoying reading and learning from her writing.
I think that was the part where maybe I felt the dumbest. I was like, man, I don't know. I guess I did not know anything about this stuff. But it was interesting, but it certainly opened up. Like, I have a lot to think about and learn. But on that note, so I know I word it as like, what resources would you recommend? I think because I talk to academics so much, I should probably rephrase that as, if you were writing a syllabus on this topic, what would you add to that? And that can be books, articles, videos, podcasts, anything. But so where would you send people to learn more about embodiment in the Hebrew Bible of the divine, and just embodiment in general?
Right. All right. Yeah, that is a difficult question. As I say, the major work in this area has been done by Benjamin Summers, and Mark Smith is another author who's written extensively and very influentially and helpfully on the topic of divine embodiment. Esther Hamori's book When Gods Were Men. So it's been foundational for this discussion. I'm trying to think of I wish I could think of a movie. I can't really. I guess one much newer, but which is not so much related to God's embodiment in the Hebrew Bible, but is really helpful on the topic of embodiment, is Anathea Portier-Young's book called, I think, The Prophetic Body. It's a book on embodiment as a something to bear in mind reading prophecy. I'm sorry, I can't think of a movie though. I wish I could.
No, that's okay. I mean, if you knew of one, it would come to mind. Okay, what do you read for fun?
My husband is Italian, so I quite like reading translations of Italian novels. I Promessi Sposi, The Betrothed, by Mancini is my sort of favorite Italian novel, but I really enjoy some mid-20th century Italian novels as well. I just read the books on which that BBC series called The Midwife was based, because my other daughter had an interest in studying nursing. I really enjoyed those.
So this is weird. So not that long ago, I had someone on to talk about their doctoral dissertation, and it was on anthropomorphic representations of the divine in the Greek and Hebrew Pentateuch. Ellen de Donker.
Yeah.
Okay, so similarity there, but I believe her husband is also Italian, and so she was also, when I asked this question, I don't think it was the same one, but I think she also recommended an Italian novel. So that's a nice area of professional and personal symmetry that the two of you have.
Okay, yeah. I'll hope to meet her and talk about
it. Okay, yeah. You know what? Call the Midwives looks so interesting, but it's a show that I forget exists, and I only see it when I don't actually have time to start a new show. But it does look good. Okay, well, man, this was quick, and that was, honestly, you're very good at answering the questions. Actually, more questions than I even ask. So if you don't have anything else for us, I'm going to call this one good.
Much. It was great to talk to you, and thank you for having me on.
Thank you. Okay, take care.
Okay, enjoy the event. Bye-bye.
All right, another episode down. Next week on the podcast is the return of Eric Harvey. Eric and I spoke about blindness metaphors a couple of years ago, pretty early on in the podcast, and he reached out to me about a book about reading creation myths economically. So he surveys some ancient creation myths and how they depict human activity as literally feeding divine entities. And yeah, the systems that they build around that, it's interesting stuff. So looking at the economics of creation myth, it's fun, and it's a very short book. It'll be linked in the show notes for that episode, which I should add is available right now at patreon.com/It Means What It Means podcast. If you head on over there, you can hear that now. If not, in a week, it'll be available. So just make sure you're subscribed and you have those downloads set automatically, and it'll be there on your phone or whatever device it is that you use to listen to podcasts. Yeah, okay. If you get a chance to love someone, please take it.
I'm trying to sort of undo a constriction of what we refer to as economics that's happened in the 20th century, following particularly what's called the neoliberal turn, where the economy gets sort of separated from the rest of life and extracted as its own unit of analysis. And it's been really an attempt to treat it almost akin to a natural science, right? But there's this separation of economy from life that is really, when you get right down to it, untenable, because everything we do that requires stuff has economic ramifications, right? Even a lot of the most abstracted things, the most, thinky, non-manual labor type of things, nevertheless rest on these vast and like deeply entangled economic processes and chains and flows of materials and labor and money. And so religion in particular is also has a highly economic side that we just try to suppress in a lot of our discourse, right? Religious buildings have to be built. Religious professionals have to be paid. They have to, make enough money to eat. Materials for our weekly services and other parts of religious life together have to be purchased. Everything in religion has an economic component. And on the flip side, like economics, the way that we exchange goods, money, labor, exchange or compel or volunteer, etc., all of those things are economic, but they are also deeply, deeply conditioned by the realities of our social existence, right? They are so culturally inflected by the structure of our society, by the nature of relations between classes, between genders, between people groups, right? Like trading partners, etc. All of these things are all economic and social. So I really treat economics as a social science or component of anthropology rather than as a hard science, as you'll often have it taught in economics classrooms in universities today.